Shalom and welcome everyone to the ICEJ webinar series. I'm David Parsons, one of the vice presidents here at the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, and our senior spokesman. We're coming to you, of course, a little over 2 months into Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza and the other fronts that we could mention, Hezbollah in Lebanon, also terror sweeps through the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, and the Houthi Yemens. Lots of regional developments to talk about. And today we'll be covering the topic of Israel's war of re-independence, or many say Israel is fighting its second war of independence. Of course, referring to when Israel first had to fight for its national sovereignty here in 1948. And the topic was selected by our guest today. Our featured guest is Dr. Dan Diker. I've known Dan for over 2 decades. He's always been very available when we did Front Page Jerusalem Radio, so many other things. He's spoken at our conferences. But Dan has been with the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, one of the prominent, preeminent think tanks here in Jerusalem. And about a year or so ago, he was promoted to president of that very important institution. Good to have you, Dan.
Thank you very much, and shalom from New York City, David. Where I'm here trying to embrace our brothers and sisters here across the seas, who have many of them have a very frightened sense of their own safety and security as Jews, noting that they have never felt under threat since the Nazi period, regarding the title of today's talk and discussion between us.
Okay, so we're going to let you go ahead and sort of frame today's discussion. I've heard many Israelis say it. We feel like we're fighting for our homes, like the generation did in 1948 in Israel's War of Independence. The Palestinians call it a Nakba. Is this a second Nakba? Is it a second War of Independence? What Israel has faced since October 7th, please.
David, it's very compelling that you opened the program with the word Nakba, because what we face today, in contradistinction to what we faced 75 and almost 76 years ago, was then a war of independence in the true sense of the word, having come out of the ashes of the Holocaust, the worst instance of mass murder of Jews certainly in 2,000 years, and maybe ever. I'm talking about the Holocaust itself, the Nazi Holocaust. David, the word Nakba that you just used has to be understood in context, and it's very telling as to what we're facing today. In 1948, when the Arabs and the Arabs inside geographical Palestine that were being mobilized by the Arab Legion outside of Israel, they intended to incinerate, to eviscerate, to destroy the Jews inside of Israel at that time, and they failed. And their failure is why they called it the Nakba. The Nakba in Arabic means the disaster. And it wasn't the disaster that they were exiled or ran away to other Arab countries and to the West. The Nakba was their failure in their own eyes of murdering the Jews, of killing the Jews, and then being exiled. And that is what we're facing today. What will be a Nakba, I can promise you, is that the Hamas and their taskmasters and their mentors in Tehran, who form the greatest threat to the Judeo-Christian tradition, to Jews and Christians, to Western civilization since the Second World War period and the Nazi regime. This is what we face today is a war of intended extermination, no different than the Nazi regime had in mind for the Jews in World War II. But the difference today, and this is why we call today's discussion the re-independence of Israel. The difference today is that Israel, having been a card-carrying member of the United Nations General Assembly since 1949, has been attacked in a way that we were not attacked in 1947 and 48, and that is with a war of deception, with a war that is being led by, characterized by, punctuated and accented by the greatest instance of what we call not only deception, but disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. And this is what really is a greater threat to the Jewish people in the state of Israel today than even the physical war that is taking place as we speak in Gaza and even over the northern border opposite the Hezbollah and opposite Syria. Because today, David, the element of a state's legitimacy in the international community as being monitored minute by minute by cell phones and by instant communication and by social networks. These are weapons of war. And if states today fail to assert their international legitimacy, then it becomes very difficult for them to defend themselves, to argue for their just existence in the international community. It threatens isolation. It threatens the ability for any state to defend itself. And this is the major element in today's challenge for the nation state of the Jewish people, a tiny state of one of the tiniest states in the world that faces one of the largest threats that any country could imagine opposite its people. So it's re-independence because we not only faced a physical threat to our existence on October the 7th, 2023, when for the first time since the founding of Israel in 1948 and the third Commonwealth of the Jewish people in history, we faced a situation physically of existential threat in the sense that the Iran-backed Hamas penetrated and violated our international border, invaded with 3,000 people from Gaza, led by the Hamas operatives, but also including the public. There were women and men and young boys with machetes and with other weapons that came in. And by the way, a lot of those weapons were modern weapons and advanced capability of machine guns, and mounted on pickup trucks, hundreds of pickup trucks that violated and invaded our borders and massacred our children and mass raped our women and our children and burned families alive. This type of barbarism, of savagery, is reminiscent in its essence of some medieval invasion between civilizations of savagery. And there is an existential moment in that savagery, David, that we haven't seen because Israel as a nation state was unable to protect its women and children and civilians, which is part of the social contract between the people of this country and its government, was the contract of protection. After the Holocaust, we said, from the ashes of Birkenau and Dachau, never again failed on October the 7th. And in that sense, there was a physical threat to our existence because Israel was unable to defend its women and children for the first time since the Nazi Holocaust. And in that sense, the existential implication physically of that attack, David, was that the Hamas we now know had far more devilish plans than we might have thought on October the 7th. And you may have heard, as one of the great, I would say, students or sources of knowledge of the Middle East yourself, that the Hamas had the intention of penetrating Israel up to Jerusalem and beyond, cutting Israel in half, extending its mass murder and assault into Judea and Samaria, and invading Israeli cities in a way that the Western world has not been exposed to. And in that sense, creating an existential threat of unprecedented import across Israeli cities. If you can imagine thousands of Hamas taking thousands of Israelis captive, not hundreds, but thousands, massacring in cities across, up and down the western coast, and then cutting Israel into two, we would have had a situation of that would be unimaginable. And as it was, David, it was an unimaginable violation of human dignity and a violation of personal and collective sovereignty. In that sense, David, it was an existential threat that the Israeli heroism, there were men and women both who lost their lives in defending the homeland and keeping these mass murderers contained to southern Israel. And we remember, David, that many people are unaware of the fact that on October the 7th, 8 weeks ago, not only were the kibbutzim and the small towns, communities surround what they called the Otef, the envelope around Gaza in the southern Negev, were they decimated and in many cases incinerated, reminiscent of the Nazi atrocities, but that they succeeded in penetrating our cities. They went into Ofakim, into Sderot. They went into real cities and took hostage in police stations and in buildings. And you heard the screams of women and children and men who were watching these Hamas barbarians climbing up the stairs of residential buildings, moving into elevators. These are scenes of horror films of Netflix that we cannot even imagine. And even so, the Israeli men and women of the police forces, the security forces, the army, the civil guard, heroically put themselves in the line of fire and saved an even greater physical massacre. That is the first reason why this is a talk this morning between the two of us, and I'll finish my introduction in a moment, that's called the re-independence of Israel, because there was, again, a physical threat of extermination of the Jews that was prevented beyond the South. Number two, and I think this is the larger theme of our discussion this morning, David, and that is that if the cell phone and the social networks are the arbiter of legitimacy today because of the ability, not only of our ability to have this conversation over Zoom between New York and Jerusalem, over a cell phone, over a social network, on a what used to be called a TV network, but now it's called Zoom. Everybody is a member of the Zoom family, if you will, enabling this type of extraordinary moment-to-moment communication. But it's that moment-to-moment communication that also poses a threat to people's existence, because with the cell phone, you can mobilize 7 billion people in just a minute or two. And that is what is happening. The malign behavior of these terrible actors, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Palestinian Authority, Iran, the Houthis, and the radicals in the Western discourse today, the Marxist, Leninist radicals that have married their intersectional cause, as it were, with the Islamists. And I can tell you here from New York City. They are roving gangs of keffiyeh wearing men and women that are calling on Hamas to continue its genocidal attack against Jews. And let me just finish this comment about the existential threat through the threat to our legitimacy with a personal story. Just the day before yesterday, I was walking down Madison Avenue on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, New York City, and I came upon a roving gang of keffiyeh wearing, flag waving, what they call pro-Palestinian demonstrators who had just been on a Park Avenue parade of what they call pro-Palestine. It has nothing to do with pro-Palestine. It has to do with destroy Israel and the Jews. And I came upon them, and they were tearing down with fire in their eyes and hatred in their heart posters of children and women in Gaza that had been kidnapped. And they are posters pasted all over Manhattan calling for the return of these kidnapped victims. And these so-called pro-Palestinian protesters, we came upon one another in violent rhetorical confrontation, and they said to me, "It's all a lie. You, the Jews, have made this up. You, the Jews, have deceived the world." And in that, David, you see the Nazi-like propaganda of Der Stürmer and the Nazi-like propaganda of Göring and of Hitler, accusing the Jews of being evil and paving the way towards their physical extermination. This is the feeling in New York, and I can say that it is a risk for Jews, even in New York City, which is the capital of the Jewish people, if you will, outside of Israel, with 3 million Jews. People are frightened to wear their kippot and signs of Jewish identification on their bodies. This is a situation we have not seen since the Second World War era. So it is a conversation this morning of re-independence because of this combination of physical threat, as well as I would call this the threat of international legitimacy, and that legitimacy is also under threat.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Dan. There's a lot to unpack here, but it's a very good starting point. If I might inject a little positive note into this discussion, here at the Christian Embassy, we represent Christians who recognize that in the past, it was Christians in the name of Christ spewing false accusations and heaping upon the Jews all these falsities about killing Christian children, to bake matzah, and all the lies, the anti-Christian anti-Semitism of the past. And we have repented and feel totally the opposite now, and are wanting to tell the world it was wrong when we did it then, and it's wrong when Hamas and Arabs and the pro-Palestinian supporters accuse you of lies today. So things can change, but you're right. This is a very, very dire moment for Israel, the Jewish people. We met with he's one of the spokesmen at the foreign ministry early on. There were several Christian leaders here in Jerusalem who he called in to meet with us. And he said, look, because of these home invasions and chopping people up and the rapes and the murders right in your beds of your children and all, that all of Israel, the only way they're getting along, he said, is we're all it's only sleeping pills and alcohol. It's the only way we can get to sleep right now. It was quite, a somber message from him. But even though it happened along the Gaza border, and that heroism that pushed it all back into Gaza for now, all of Israel felt their homes were invaded that day. And that physical shock even came to me as a Christian who lives about 3 blocks from the Arab side of East Jerusalem, and you felt it very strongly.
Yeah, very much so, David. The feeling I think that you're trying to convey is one of, you know what, anything can happen.
Yes.
If the unthinkable happened and Israel was actually invaded without our people being able to defend themselves for some hours, for a few hours, what anything can happen. You just mentioned living, in Jerusalem, which is a mixed city. And by the way, we should tell our blessed listeners, and viewers, that in general, Jerusalem has been quiet. Jerusalem has been calm. The Arabs of East Jerusalem, and even the Arabs that live right with us throughout Jerusalem, have recognized that the coexistence is more important than the Islamist and nationalist incitement that has been attempting to inflame and the entire region, because that is the Hamas doctrine, as Arafat's doctrine was until he died in 2004, was to ignite the entire Arab Muslim world against the Jews. And by the way, objectifying the Christians on the way, because Arafat and the Hamas are speaking in the name of the Christian of Christianity. And this is intolerable, and it really requires, David, our Christian brothers and sisters to stand up and disallow, prohibit themselves of being objectified and used by the Hamas as weaponry against the Jews.
Yeah, Arafat always talked about how he was custodian of all the mosques, minarets, and churches of Jerusalem. No one appointed him that. Look, I am surprised, given what happened in May of 21, 11-day rocket war, when there were fights and street brawls between Jews and Arabs in some of Israel's mixed cities. It seems to me that a lot of most Israeli Arabs, and even in East Jerusalem, even in the West Bank, they thought Hamas, they were shocked themselves. Hamas went too far in what they did on October 7, and they don't want to live under that sort of rule, that sort of demonic regime.
You're absolutely right, David. You're referring to what was known as the Guardian of the Wall counterterrorism operation following the Hamas assault in May of 2021. Many of our viewers may not remember that this is not the first, nor the second, nor the third Hamas mass assault. But since the Iranian regime in between 2014 and 2018 essentially became the strategic mentors and financiers of the Hamas in Gaza, including having Iranian agents on the ground in Gaza, in the tunnels, there has been a fundamental shift in strategy and upgrade in their strategic capabilities, in their ideological inspiration, even though we know that Hamas are Sunni and their mentors are radical Shia, that has its own tensions in between. But nonetheless, you refer to May 2021, when the Hamas succeeded to ignite the passions and the fury of Israeli Arabs in a couple of cities. But we should bear in mind, the vast majority of Israeli Arabs remained quiet and did not participate in some of what essentially were lynching mobs in Lod, which was or they say in Arabic, in Lida or in Lod, which is right next to Ben Gurion Airport, in which roving gangs of Israeli Arabs were actually looking to lynch Jews. But it definitely was limited, but that is another underlying factor in today's discussion called the re-independence of Israel, because this has been a process of ideological, religious, and physical assault on the very existence of the nation state of the Jewish people. Remember, the name of this Hamas massacre, remember what it's called, David?
It's called the Al-Aqsa storm, or deluge, flood.
The deluge, you said it well. It's the Al-Aqsa flood. And the meaning is, for them, that Jerusalem, as the focus of our Judeo-Christian heritage, is, in their view, the epicenter of this religious jihad against the Jews. And I will say again, it's against the Christian world as well. Osama bin Laden called the Christian world the Crusaders as he brought down the Twin Towers in New York and hit the Pentagon in 9/11. And he called the Jews the Zionists. And let's remember that the Hamas today is the Al-Qaeda of today. It is the ISIS of today. It is the Osama bin Laden of today, sitting in Gaza and sitting in Tehran. And they have made this religious mandate to destroy the Jews and attack the Christians part of their collective identity and intention for Islam to take over not only Al-Aqsa Mosque, which they accuse the Jews of defying, and of the word is not only of defiling is the word I'm looking for. Defiling the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and talk about what we started our conversation this morning, David. Talk about the deception of Hamas, where if you and I go together to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, to the Western Wall, and to the mosque, we will see thousands and thousands of Muslims praying in peace every single Friday under the protection of the Israelis. And here the Hamas, with malice aforethought, deceptively accuse the Jews not only of failing to protect them, but of trying to defile their holy sites. It's an absolute insane sense of Nazi-like deception. And this is exactly the threat, as I said before in our conversation, to Israel's very legitimacy and to the legitimacy of the Jewish people and their collective right to have their own mini-state here in the land of Israel.
Yeah, I can verify. I live about a block and a half from a really stunning overlook towards the old city of Jerusalem from the south, the Temple Mount, and I can verify that this past Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles, at the end of it, they launched this Al-Aqsa Storm. It was actually the quietest Sukkot on the Temple Mount we've had in several years. Usually there's rock throwing and all sorts of stuff going on up there, fighting Israeli forces from the Al-Aqsa Mosque and all these views, but it was quiet, but they still launched it. It was part of their deception, I suppose, trying to hide what they were doing. We're talking here about the renewal of a physical battle over Israelis. Everyone feels they're fighting for their homes, and the ideological diplomatic battle over Israel's legitimacy, that it feels like 48 again, when Israel had been accepted by the international community in the UN partition plan vote that approved a state that Israel then declared. In 48, the slogan was, we're going to drive the Jews into the sea. Today, it is from the river to the sea, the Palestine shall be free. Is there really any difference in that? Of course, some will say, we're just talking about free, but they mean the whole land. They want to free it of Jewish sovereignty, and some of them free it of Jews, like 48.
It's true, David. I think there is a distinction. It's a very interesting point that you raise here. The Egyptians, the Syrians, and even less the Jordanians, but the Egyptians and the Syrians were leading this crusade by saying, we will throw the Jews into the sea. As a matter of fact, that was a term, an expression that was used by none other than Ahmed Shkeri, who was the first chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization. He said that in 1964, and that was a continuation of what his brothers had said in 1948. And in fact, it's interesting that expression was very much why Ahmed Shkeri did not last as the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and because the idea in 1948 was that we will kill the Jews and take Palestine as part of an Islamic, part of the Arab, the Islamic land that could not be taken over by anyone else except Muslims. And therefore, there was no claim at that time, not in 1948, and not subsequently by the Arab world, that this was Palestinian land. They claimed that this was Muslim land. This was a war to the death between the Arab world and these Zionists that came, in their view, from Europe and were part of the colonialist British and French takeover of the Middle East. Now the story has changed completely, because now the deception has asserted that this is Palestine. This has been, not only geographical Palestine, commensurate with the Sahara Desert as a geographical area with no national affiliation to it on the Arab side. But in fact, this had been historical Palestine, and the Palestinian people's land had been co-opted and stolen by the Jews. So it's far worse, because it accuses the Jews of stealing. There you have those anti-Semitic tropes. The Jews are stealing the land of the poor, of the Palestinians, which in a way is a moral challenge to the people of the West, because this notion is that the evil Jews have stolen the birthright of an indigenous population. It speaks to the social and moral revolution taking place in the West, or the moral threat to the West of the progressive radical camp of which is characterized by victimhood and color and identity politics, wokeism. And so that makes it a far greater threat than even in 1948. Because when you say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free at Harvard University, we are witnessing the convergence of gay people and militants from different ethnic groups, together with Palestinian protesters, that create an evil intersectional Marxist, Leninist, a fascist combination of people who see themselves as victims, who see they don't see the Palestinian marauders as invaders, but in fact as victims, and they see the Jews, as the villains. And that narrative is what is a great threat to Israel's legitimacy. And they say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This has been a Hamas idea since 1988, when Hamas charter was established. That Palestine, quote unquote, will be free of Jews. So it's similar in intent as to what we saw in 1948, but in effect, it's far worse, because it claims the Jews who have a state and have had their state for 75 years have actually stolen the birthright, if you will, of the indigenous brown people, which is a narrative that plays so well in the West, which in many ways has lost its identity and lost its way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the I guess the end games of this delegitimization of Israel, and Israel, as you say, fighting again like it had to in 48 to defend its sovereignty and defend its legitimacy as a member state of the international community. Today, there's this, you hear it, we've heard not only Hamas say it, we've heard Palestinian Authority leaders say it. I believe Turkish officials have said it. Some of the Iranians have said it, that Israel as an occupier does not have the right of self-defense. And I believe we've seen this effort before, but the way they're defining it now, if you occupy land, you do not have the right to defend yourself in that land. But what needs to be made clear is they consider the whole land from the river to the sea occupied, and not just Gaza and the West Bank. First of all, how solid is this claim that Israel was still an occupier of Gaza, because they controlled the airspace, they controlled the borders? Egypt also controls the border.
A question for you. Does the United States control the airspace over Mexico? Does the United States affect or defend itself in the airspace, even between Canada and the United States? Answer, of course it does. Question number two, how well did this claim that Israel effectively occupies Gaza, even though there's not one Jew anywhere near inside Gaza? They pulled out lock, stock, and barrel in 2005 forcing 8,500 Jews who had lived there for 3 generations to leave Gaza in the hope that that would generate a peaceful outcome. And in fact, Gaza, David, as you and I know, is basically a state. It is a state called Hamastan. It's a state that is controlled by Hamas, that is quote unquote protected, or another way of saying it, terrorized by Hamas, financed by Iran and Hamas, receiving tens of billions of dollars since 2005, when Israel pulled out of Gaza lock, stock, and barrel. Israel did have what they call a sea embargo against Hamas. Why? Because of the great fear based on evidence that Hamas continually and continuously, with the help of the Iranian regime, was getting weaponry into Gaza. Well, how well placed in retrospect was the Israeli concern about the stream and the flow of these weapons? I guess the embargo, so-called, or the what they call the siege. Here comes that deception language again. The sea siege of Israel against Gaza. It didn't go that well, did it? Because all of the weaponry that Israel was supposed to have prevented of entering into Gaza and actually succeeded in getting into Gaza. So that is a complete refutation of the nonsense that people are talking about when they say that Israel de facto occupies Gaza. We took a tremendous risk to our safety and security, and the risk did not pay off because the massacre occurred. So all of the the ridiculous claims that Hamas was that Gaza was not independent. There you have that victim. That's that victim narrative again. They, in any other situation in the world, they could have turned that into the Singapore of the Middle East. And in the meantime, they turned it into hell on the Mediterranean, because they preferred to spend those billions of dollars on the most sophisticated underground terror tunnel and metro network anywhere in the world, instead of building infrastructures and schools and a thriving, prosperous society, which they could well have done.
Yeah. If Israel was still occupying Gaza, they weren't doing a very good job of it, huh?
No, they certainly weren't, were they?
And if they're committing genocide against the Palestinian people, they're not doing a very good job of it, because the Palestinian population just keeps expanding and exploding, according to a lot of the demographers. A couple questions here. Again, I think it's important, just so our viewers know, that when a lot of these Palestinians or pro-Palestinians talk about occupation, they're not talking about the West Bank and Gaza. They're talking about the entire land. They do not recognize the legitimacy of the Jewish state. And it was great hearing President Biden at the Hanukkah reception at the White House the other night, saying, I recognize not only Israel's right to exist, but to exist as a Jewish state. Very important. But Hamas is like the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded out of Egypt, has branches including in Turkey, which is Erdogan in Turkey, the president of Turkey, is a Muslim Brotherhood. Why is it Hamas is the only one that has picked up arms to fight now, whereas these other chapters take the slow approach, education, slowly creeping, annexing, taking over everything until they're ready to set up? They have the same goal of a worldwide caliphate.
It's true, David, and I think you raised an important point, is that the Muslim Brotherhood is an ideological organization, has a strategy, a political strategy, which can be traced back to its beginnings in 1928, when the Hassan al-Banna in Egypt founded the Muslim Brotherhood. And there was a whole ideology behind the Muslim Brotherhood that was based on this idea of Jalaliya, that the primitive pre-Islamic, I would call it ignorance, had invaded the world once again, and it was up to the Muslim Brotherhood to educate the world as to the importance of Muslim dominance over the world. It wasn't primarily a military idea. It was a religious, ideological, and political idea that would play itself out not only in Egypt, but it would actually evolve to become, the Wahhabi thinking. The Muslim Brotherhood were the ideological precursors to Al Qaeda, actually, and to the Wahhabi movement. So there was a militarization of the Muslim Brotherhood idea over the last century, but it's not automatically Hamas. It evolved into Hamas. It also evolved into a militarized reality in Jordan over the last years, and this is why Jordan is very frightened of the Muslim Brotherhood in its own country. The militarization of the Muslim Brotherhood we have seen primarily in Gaza and less so in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. But that's where we have seen this, as we said, militarization of the Muslim Brotherhood idea that is not like the Hamas everywhere it exists. But the Hamas, I think, has seen itself as the head of the spear of the Muslim Brotherhood idea, which is really reflective of the more militant approach of Said Qutb, who was I think he was the inheritor and he who carried forward the legacy in the 1950s in Egypt and tried to overthrow Egypt. I mean, he threatened Egypt. Said Qutb did and he was hanged by Egypt. I think it was in the either mid 50s or early 60s by Egypt. So it's not automatically a military operation, but it has become, Hamas has turned that into the army of the Muslim Brotherhood, if you will, from Gaza. That's the sort of the psychological dynamic that it sees itself playing out, and it definitely sees itself as Salah ad-Din, the Islamic warriors for the whole Middle East and for the world. That's the way they see themselves, and that's where they see their success. They see this operation, this massacre, as a great success because of the psychological messaging that it sends the rest of the Arab Muslim world as well as to the West.
Mm-hmm. Hey, let me ask you the sort of shift we're seeing in Turkey with Erdogan, which is his welfare party. They call it Dawa, I think, in Islam, social welfare, helping the poor and all. But he's a Muslim Brotherhood leader. How serious a shift is this, where he's turned very anti-Israel? Of course, there were always troubles and problems, but this seems like one big long temper tantrum by him. But is that movement going to turn Turkey into a jihadist nation that threatens not only Israel but many other countries in the region?
Well, you see, David, that there are countries in the Middle East. Turkey as a non-Arab Muslim country, and in fact, Turkey was the great hope for the West, having joined NATO, and yet they're playing a double game because Erdogan is a true believer. He's a Muslim brother, and he, as a Muslim brother, has become the host for the Hamas in the Middle East, replacing Syria as the host country for the Hamas. And there were actually, in a related point, there were actually murmurs.
Because the Hamas had sided with the Sunnis in the Syrian civil war. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. They sided with the Sunnis in the Syrian civil war. And let's remember, the Syrian Alawite family that controls Syria is an offshoot of Shiism. Yeah. So they, in their anger, their fury over Hamas's siding with the Sunnis in the civil war, they expelled the Hamas, and the Hamas found a new home in Turkey. And Turkey
and Qatar.
And Qatar. So Qatar and Turkey have become they've become actors that are playing double games. Of course, Qatar is a Muslim Brotherhood capital. Really, we call it a bank with a flag, as opposed to a country. And we expected both that Turkey and Qatar would have been able to return our kidnapped women and children and men within hours, or if not days, from Hamas. And it's absolutely intolerable that with all of the money and the power that they have, that they were not able to immediately return our kidnapped civilians. It's absolutely intolerable and really unimaginable that they weren't able to do that. And I think, by the way, on that point, that the United States has not done what it is in its power to do to prevail both upon the NATO member Turkey as well as Qatar, where America has a major military fleet installation. They were not able to prevail upon those countries to return every single last hostage. I find it absolutely unintelligible and morally intolerable. But your question is, whether he is turning Turkey. What he has done is he turned Turkey into a psychiatric case, because on the one hand, he mobilizes the Turkish identity of people against Israel. We've seen that since 2010 and the Mavi Marmara ship incident, where the Turkish fundamentalist party sent what's called a humanitarian ship, which was nothing of the sort. It was a weapon ship into Gaza, stopped by Israel. As you remember, there was a real confrontation there where a number of Israeli soldiers were killed and wounded, and we killed a number of those operatives on that ship. And since then, we know from 2 years before, when Erdogan actually delegitimized and demonized Shimon Peres, our former prime minister, in an international forum, we saw that Turkey had become very adversarial. And even though today, as we speak in this conversation, Turkey has relations with Israel because of its own economic fears and the fears of being isolated because of the emergence of Iran and the Iranian axis of evil, axis of resistance, or what they call axis of terror, it is playing a double game all the time. And this is an issue we have to watch very, very carefully, because Turkey was a great friend under the Kemalist, under these Kemalist years of what we call secularism in Turkey, or the division, separation of mosque and state, that now has been refused by Erdogan and his Muslim Brotherhood fellow travelers that run Turkey. And Erdogan is really a dictator. He's been there for, goodness gracious, he's been there for many, many, many years.
Yes. He and Putin and
Absolutely.
the boss. Yeah, we may see some real turnover in the leadership in the region soon. Dan, we're going to have to start wrapping up. Anything else that you want to say? I really hope these messages are getting through to the people, especially this thing of how Hamas, even in their charter, they start with the Jews, but they're actually aiming towards the Crusader West. They still consider us Crusaders.
Absolutely. Well, it's a moment that requires moral clarity, David. If the Judeo-Christian West must understand that its way of life, its moral structure, its civilization is under threat. And what starts with the Jews doesn't end up only with the Jews. And this is why the message that we must send forth from Jerusalem is that our very way of life, our values, our existence here as a civilization that is underpinned by Judeo-Christian values is under existential threat. And that's Iran, the Iranian regime, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, the other members of the axis of terror. And it really compels us to act together. Israel needs the hundreds of millions of Christians, the billion, the worldwide Christian population, David, is a billion.
It's 2.2 or so, I believe.
2.2 billion people. We need the Christian world to stand up for Israel in an unequivocal voice of moral clarity, because this is really a war of civilizations, and we're on the same side for sure. And we're here in Israel, as you are right now, protecting the very heritage of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the moral inheritance of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and this is very much what's under threat. So this is a call from Jerusalem for our Christian brothers and sisters, the 2.2 billion around the world and more, to stand together with the Jewish and democratic state.
Okay, well, thank you. We've been speaking to Dr. Dan Diker. He is president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, one of the preeminent think tanks in Israel on strategic issues. Also, the founder, Dr. Elazar, was an educator, all sorts of social educational issues, public affairs. And your website, jcpa.org. Right?
Yes, please come to our website at jcpa.org. We have a daily news and analysis update at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 days a week. And we would like to send you the daily alert, which is a presidential briefing hyperlinked every single day. You can sign up at jcpa.org. Also, please feel very welcome to partner with us and support us. We're very close friends and partners of the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem. So you would be donating to the same family. But of course, your first priority, as I would say, is to support the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem. But if you're so inclined to have a second opportunity, that we would hope that you would come and support us, because we're here fighting on the front lines together with our Christian brothers and sisters at the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem for the future of our people.
Yeah, that's good. Dan is putting together like a webinar like this every day, going into a lot of detail on the conflict, the current situation. You can watch that every day. And the daily alert, it's an email, comes for free to your email box, your inbox, but I've been a subscriber there since it started 20 years or so ago. It's an excellent daily digest, summaries of all the main news stories out of Israel and the Middle East affecting this region. Thank you, Dan, for your time. All the best. Happy Hanukkah. And we just want to thank everyone for joining us again today. Join us next week, Thursday, 3 p.m. We'll come to you again. I think we'll probably go to some sort of Bible teaching with the Christmas holiday coming up, but we will relate it to the current conflict in some way. You got to stay tuned. Could join us next week to find out how, but it is a very relevant and interesting connection. And every day at the top of the hour now, we have our daily global prayer gathering. Join with Christian leaders from Israel and around the world to be praying every day through this conflict, 4 p.m. Israel time. And you can go to icej.org to find the link to the daily global prayer gathering. God bless you, and happy Hanukkah, happy Christmas from the Jerusalem.
Thank you for joining us for this informative webinar. Be sure to subscribe to our social media channels or visit our website at icej.org for upcoming webinars and more ICEJ